The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on federal efforts to mitigate vulnerabilities in the food supply chain. Good morning. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. This hearing was originally scheduled, as you know, for last Thursday, but we had to postpone the hearing due to the House-Senate Conference Committee on the 9/11 bill. So I appreciate the witnesses' flexibility and patience, and I certainly thank you all for coming back here today on what I know is a very important subject. Recent months have brought increased attention to vulnerabilities in the United States food supply chain. Today's hearing will present us with both the public and private sector perspectives on how best to secure our food distribution networks. In the last year, we have witnessed foodborne illness outbreaks associated with spinach, lettuce, and peanut butter, among others. This spring, incidents including the melamine contamination of vegetable proteins used in pet foods, the diethylene glycol contamination of toothpaste, and drug residues in fish demonstrated how intentional food adulteration can pose a far greater challenge than unintentional contamination. And many of these incidents were traced back to problems associated with the Chinese food supply. And it is evident that China's food and drug safety standards are often weak, poorly enforced, or both, though I'm encouraged by recent indications that China's Food and Drug Administration will be making their processes more transparent in order to ensure more stringent safety measures. Unfortunately, China isn't the only problem country. Developing nations in Africa and parts of Latin America also have significant food safety issues, and it would be short-sighted to place the blame on one country or in one region. This is a global problem and has the potential to cripple the food supply throughout the United States. Now, we're here today to figure out how, in working with both the private sector and public sector partners, we can mitigate vulnerabilities and secure our food supply chain here at home. Just as the nation's food sector is comprised of a variety of distinct businesses and operations, so too is the federal government's effort in defending the food supply from intentional attacks and natural hazards. Now, it's not an easy task, and there's a lot of work that we must complete, but we all understand what is at stake. Now, I'm reminded that 100 years ago, Upton Sinclair's investigation into the Chicago meatpacking plants led to the formation of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. That investigation is still relevant today and demonstrates the need for transparency in ensuring the safety of these systems. In fact, in 2004, the President issued Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9 to help achieve this goal. HSPD 9 establishes a national policy to defend the agriculture and food system against terrorist attacks, major disasters, and other emergencies. In March 2005, the GAO identified confusion over the Department of Homeland Security's role in agroterrorism. The GAO voiced concern that the agencies hadn't yet evolved into its leading role under Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9. Though 2 years later, 2 years have passed, significant problems still remain. Now, as the DHS Office of the Inspector General reported in a February 2007 review of Homeland Security food defense activities, the enormity of the food sector and the complexity of government oversight pose substantial challenges to the food defense and critical infrastructure protection. Complexity of both systems has resulted in the recent publication of several reports critical of the bureaucracies associated with these efforts. In February 2007, GAO designated the federal oversight of food safety as a high-risk area for the first time. GAO found that a fragmented system whereby 15 agencies collectively administer at least 30 laws related to food safety causes inconsistent oversight, ineffective coordination, and inefficient use of resources. Now, this report found several management problems that reduce the effectiveness of the agency's routine efforts to protect against agroterrorism. For example, GAO noted that weaknesses in the flow of critical information existed among key stakeholders. Also, in February, the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General issued a report that found that DHS, USDA, and HHS were failing to meet their obligations under HSPD 9 to prepare an integrated food defense plan. The Inspector General recommended that DHS pursue recruitment, hiring, and retention of staff with expertise in matters of post-harvest food defense, work collaboratively with USDA and HHS on grants and other funding mechanisms to carry out food defense missions, and identify a single senior DHS official to be accountable for coordinated implementation of all DHS food sector responsibilities, and provide this official with clear authorities and adequate staffing to perform this function. Now, I hope that the officials before us today can discuss their efforts to improve some of the issues that have been raised. The integrity of our nation's food supply is critical to our national, economic, and health security. There is much work to be done to fully secure our food supply chain, and we must act swiftly to shore up the remaining vulnerabilities. That concludes my opening statement. The Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I'd like to start out by pointing out that the United States food supply is among the safest in the world. Still, public health officials estimate that over 5,000 people die and many more get sick from foodborne illnesses each year. Recent incidents of non-terrorist related food contamination, such as the E. coli outbreaks in produce and antibiotics in fish from China, showed just how easy it would be for a terrorist to manipulate our food supply against us and to utilize it as a weapon of mass destruction. I don't want to overstate the threat posed by terrorist attacks against the food supply. In fact, there are very few recorded acts of intentional food contamination. I believe only 2 in the United States. But there's no question that the food supply chain is vulnerable, and I'm not very confident that we are protecting this critical asset. The U.S. food and agriculture sector is comprised of more than 2 million farms, approximately 900,000 firms, and 1.1 million facilities, almost entirely under private ownership. This sector accounts for about 20% of the nation's economic activity, and we cannot afford to have consumer confidence undermined. Federal efforts to ensure the safety of our food supply have historically been fragmented. There are at least 30 different food safety laws and a patchwork of regulations administered by 15 different agencies. Subtle differences between food products can dictate which agency regulates it. For example, if a packaged ham sandwich is open-faced, it is regulated by the USDA. If it has 2 slices of bread, it is regulated by the FDA. That's almost comical when you think about it. What is needed here is a cross-agency perspective, one plan that provides a single framework to ensure that all agencies' goals are complementary and reinforcing, not redundant. We can and must do better. There are some encouraging signs, including the recent establishment of DHS's Office of Health Affairs and the consolidation of agriculture inspectors within Customs and Border Patrol's overall anti-terrorism mission. The focus of today's hearing is on the food safety and food defense efforts. It is a sensitive topic, and I hope that we hear more about what we are doing to enhance the protection of our food supply rather than on the vulnerabilities themselves. We certainly don't want to advertise our specific vulnerabilities, so please consider this in your testimony. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the distinguished chairman for reconvening the previously postponed hearing today. The theme of this hearing is extremely fitting given the circumstances this past year, where our nation has had to deal with issues of pet food, spinach, peanut butter, and more recently, bans on toothpaste and even the FDA ban on seafood products. The major threats to the food agriculture sector is a crisis of confidence, where a poorly prevented or recognized event causes people to question the safety of food regionally or nationally. The time to address whether our food infrastructure is designed to mitigate vulnerabilities is before an occurrence and not after the fact. We've been extremely fortunate that our agriculture has been safe, but we've got work to do if we want to be more secure. Currently, 15 agencies collectively administer at least 30 laws related to food safety, causing ineffective oversight, inefficient coordination, and inconsistent agency leadership. One concern I look forward to hearing our witnesses today is the current agency leadership structure in place in the event of a foodborne emergency. HSPD 9 sets out to address this by establishing the Department of Homeland Security as having the lead role in policy coordination in an event of national significance. However, a recent GAO report says that USDA is not planning for DHS to assume the lead coordinating role if an outbreak among poultry occurs that is sufficient in scope to warrant a presidential declaration of an emergency or major disaster, or a DHS disaster declaration of incident of national significance. Such an inconsistency in planning perpetuates the confusion of who's in charge. I look forward to the second panel, comprised of industry, academic, and state agricultural officials, giving us a more local perspective of what uncoordinated efforts means for our communities. Further, I look forward to discussing state and industry involvement throughout all of the coordinating and planning. Reports indicate that they do not have the ability and information to fulfill their assigned roles in protecting agriculture. Though I'm pleased to hear that strides have been made in cover plus shock technology in hardening our infrastructure against an internal attack. Technology is only as good as its application. Unless the relevant agencies begin to take HSPD 9 a step further, the United States will lack a coordinated national approach to protect against agri-terrorism, possibly resulting in gaps and needless duplication of effort. By overcoming these challenges, the United States will be in better position to protect against and respond to a foodborne disease outbreak, whether natural or intentional. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the chairman. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Before I turn to the panel, I ask unanimous consent that the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. I thank her for her attendance. Under the committee rules, Ms. Capter will be recognized for questions after the committee members. I think it's appropriate to recognize here that Ms. Capter serves on the Appropriations Subcommittee of Agriculture, Rural Development, and Food Drug Agencies, and actually introduced H.R. 2997, the Assured Food Safety Act of 2007, that would require a seal of approval of imported foods coming into the country by seal of approval by USDA or FDA, and I was proud to co-sponsor that legislation with the gentlelady. So I ask unanimous consent that she be allowed to participate in the hearing without objection. I welcome the first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. David Acheson, Assistant Commissioner of Food Protection, Food and Drug Administration at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Acheson provides advice and counsel to the Commissioner on strategic and substantive food safety and food defense matters. Dr. Acheson is published extensively and is internationally recognized both for his public health expertise in food safety and his research in infectious diseases. Welcome, Dr. Acheson. Our second witness, Dr. Carol Maczka, is the Assistant Administrator, Office of Food Defense and Emergency Response Food Safety Inspection Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Dr. Maczka has more than 20 years of experience in the field of risk assessment. Our third witness, Dr. Tom McGinn, Office of Health Affairs, Department of Homeland Security. Dr. McGinn is the Director of Veterinarian and Agricultural Security for the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. In his position, he is responsible for internal and external coordination of DHS veterinary and agricultural programs. Welcome to you as well. Our fourth witness is Dan Baldwin, Assistant Commissioner, Officer of International Trade, Customs and Border Protection, Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Baldwin's office directs the National Trade Policy and National Trade Program functions at CBP and provides uniformity and clarity for the Department of CBP's national strategy to facilitate legitimate trade. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted into the record. I want to welcome the panel here. Thank you for your testimony and presence, and I now recognize each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Dr. Acheson.
Good morning, Chairman Langevin and members of the subcommittee. I am Dr. David Acheson, Assistant Commissioner for Food Protection at the FDA. FDA appreciates the opportunity to discuss our food defense activities, and I'm pleased to be here today with my colleagues from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Agriculture. The Commissioner of Food and Drugs, Dr. Andrew von Eschenbach, recently appointed me to the new position of Assistant Commissioner for Food Protection. My first priority in this position is to develop a new strategy for the integration of food safety and food defense that will address changes in the global food safety and food defense system, identify our most critical needs, and serve as a framework to help us address the challenges we face. Food safety and food defense continue to be top priorities for this administration. A terrorist attack on the food supply could have both severe public health and economic consequences while damaging the public's confidence in the food we eat. To promote the safety of imported products, last week the President established an interagency working group to review the procedures, regulations, and practices that are in place to make sure that imported food and other products are safe. Secretary of Health and Human Services Michael Levitt will chair this working group. FDA will play a key role in the group's activities. The group expects to report back to the President within 60 days with its recommendations. At FDA, ensuring that products we regulate are safe and secure is a vital part of our public health mission. The agency regulates everything Americans eat except for meat, poultry, and processed egg products, which are regulated by USDA. A great deal has been done in the past few years to enhance the safety and defense of the food supply in the United States. FDA has worked with other federal, state, and local tribal food safety agencies, as well as with law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies, and with industry to significantly strengthen the nation's food safety and defense systems across the entire distribution chain from farm to table to better protect our food supply against deliberate and accidental threats. This cooperation has resulted in greater awareness of potential vulnerabilities, the creation of more effective prevention programs, new surveillance systems, and the ability to respond more quickly to outbreak of foodborne illness. FDA is working closely with DHS and other federal agencies to implement the President's Homeland Security presidential directives. The HHS and USDA secretaries or their designees exercise key responsibilities as food sector-specific agencies. DHS serves as the coordinator of the food and agriculture sector with the Government Coordination Council. HHS and USDA serve as co-leads for the food sector, and USDA serves as the lead for the agriculture sector. With a close working relationship of FDA and USDA and the other government and industry collaborators, the food and agriculture sector activities to protect critical infrastructure have set the organizational and operational standard for other critical infrastructure sectors. DHS recently released our sector-specific plans. To implement HSPD 9, FDA has been involved in numerous activities. For example, to increase lab surge capacity, FDA, in coordination with USDA, established the Food Emergency Response Network, or FERN, to include a substantial number of federal, state, and local labs that are capable of analyzing large numbers of food samples for agents of concern. At present, the FERN network includes 134 laboratories representing all 50 states and Puerto Rico. FDA has also developed an online food defense awareness training course in partnership with USDA. We've completed 13 vulnerability assessments as part of the Strategic Partnership Program on Agri-Terrorism. FDA has also conducted or provided funding for food defense research activities and participated in numerous emergency response exercises. In our food defense activities, FDA works closely with our state partners. For example, earlier this year, FDA conducted a food defense surveillance assignment for FDA and USDA personnel and participating state and local authorities to conduct food defense-related inspections and reconciliation exams and to collect and analyze samples of food products. This year, FDA, in cooperation with CDC, USDA, and state and local organizations representing food, public health, and agricultural interests, initiated the Alert Awareness Program. It provides a uniform and consistent approach to food defense awareness at any point in the supply chain from farm to retail. Alert identifies 5 key points that industry and businesses can use to decrease the risk of intentional food contamination at their facility. In 2003, FDA issued guidance on the security measures the food industry may take to minimize the risk that food will be subject to tampering or other malicious or terrorist actions. FDA issued a general guidance entitled Food Producers, Processors, and Transporters, Food Security Preventive Measures, and a number of others. Also in 2003, FDA began using the Carver plus Shock analytical tool to perform vulnerability assessments. FDA's approach has been to seek voluntary, mutually beneficial partnerships with various segments of the food industry. We've completed such cooperative assessments with segments of the regulated industry. Carver plus Shock method to determine the vulnerability of individual food facilities to biological, chemical, or radiological attack has resulted in the development of a software tool now available free of charge on FDA's website. In conclusion, due to the enhancements being made by FDA and other agencies, and due to the close coordination between the federal and state food safety, public health, law enforcement, and intelligence gathering agencies, the United States food defense system is stronger than ever before. Although we have made progress, we are continuously working to improve our ability to prevent, detect, and respond to terrorist threats. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss FDA's food defense activities. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Acheson. Appreciate your testimony. The chair now recognizes Dr. Maczka to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss the issues of defending our food supply. I am Dr. Carol Maczka, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Food Defense and Emergency Response at USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS. My office manages all food defense activities within FSIS and coordinates its activities with DHS, FDA, other federal and state agencies, as well as industry. FSIS is the public health agency in USDA responsible for ensuring that meat, poultry, and egg products are safe, secure, wholesome, and correctly labeled and packaged. Inspection personnel form the backbone of FSIS's food safety system. FSIS has more than 7,000 inspectors in federal meat, poultry, and egg products plants and import establishments. FSIS also has program investigators nationwide who conduct food safety and food defense investigations and enforcements. Consistent with Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9, the agency works with government and industry on improving awareness and warning systems, vulnerability assessment, mitigation strategies, response planning and recovery, and research and development. FSIS uses a comprehensive system to ensure that imported meat, poultry, and egg products are safe and secure. It includes an initial determination of the equivalence of a country's inspection systems, on-site audits, and re-inspection of all meat and poultry products coming into the United States. FSIS import inspectors ensure that shipments are properly labeled and examined. Import surveillance officers conduct surveillance activities at ports and in commerce and coordinate with other agencies such as Customs and Border Protection. The agency also works with Customs National Targeting Center to develop rule sets for targeting high-risk shipments entering the country and is moving forward on a system that will allow the sharing of import tracking data by FSIS, Customs, and DHS. FSIS and FDA co-chair the Food Emergency Response Network, FERN. It is a coordinated effort between federal, state, and local laboratories to provide ongoing surveillance as well as detection and surge capacity for large-scale food-related events. The agency has developed specific procedures for sampling food depending on threat level designated by DHS. The agency also engages in active surveillance through a series of food defense verification procedures that are performed daily in all FSIS-regulated facilities. The agency's Consumer Complaint Monitoring System, a national surveillance system, monitors food-related consumer complaints, which assists the agency in identifying potential attacks in the food supply. FSIS has conducted food defense awareness training nationwide with state and local inspectors and in cooperation with FDA, with federal agencies. FSIS has created and distributed model food defense plans for use by meat, poultry, and egg products facilities and import establishments. These plans identify the types of preventive steps that establishments might take to minimize food defense risk. The agency has also held numerous workshops and webcasts on food defense plans to reach out to small plants. In the area of responding to food emergencies, FSIS has developed state response plans and conducted 6 exercises with industry and state and federal agencies to test emergency response procedures. A total of 15 exercises are planned, which will take into account 50 states. FSIS also continues to enhance its readiness for a possible outbreak of avian influenza. The agency has conducted an exercise and developed a testing protocol for detecting high-path avian influenza in poultry meat. In addition, FSIS has actively engaged its partners in developing pandemic plans. This spring, FSIS worked closely with FDA to respond to the discovery that some swine and poultry had been fed pet food scraps containing melamine. FSIS quickly ensured that swine and poultry were held under state quarantine or voluntarily by owners. A joint risk assessment concluded that the potential exposure to the public, even in the worst-case scenario, was well below any level of public health concern. Subsequently, FSIS cleared animals on farms in question for inspection and processing. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for this opportunity to discuss FSIS's leadership role in protecting the food supply. We take pride in knowing that our nation's food supply is among the safest in the world, but we also realize that it is vital to continue to improve our system. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Maczka. The chair now recognizes Dr. McGinn for 5 minutes to summarize your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about the safety of our national food system. My name is Dr. Tom McGinn, and I serve as the Director of Food, Agriculture, and Veterinary Defense within the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Health Affairs, which is led by the Acting Assistant Secretary and Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jeff Runge. My job is to be the primary point of contact within DHS to synchronize our food, agriculture, and veterinary assets. One of our responsibilities within the Office of Health Affairs is to coordinate 30 programs within DHS that address some aspect of food, agriculture, and veterinary defense. I am pleased to testify today with Dr. Acheson, with Carol, and with Dan Baldwin with Customs and Borders as well. These are valued friends and colleagues. FDA and USDA represent the sector-specific agencies with the subject matter expertise and the legal authority for the protection of the food in our country. Together with the private sector and our state and local and academic partners whom you will hear from later today, we all provide food defense for the United States. Together, we cultivate a complex, effective set of resources that are becoming better known to each of us and better able to be integrated into a national incident management system. I will highlight the following 3 areas. 1, the contribution of DHS to food defense. 2, the Office of Health Affairs strategic plan to further implement HSPD 9. And 3, the way forward for food defense. DHS's contribution to food defense. Food defense includes activities beyond our borders and across our domestic food supply chain, as well as in our homes. It involves everyone from the local ice cream shop to the most capable sector-specific agencies of the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The large majority of incidences involving food issues are handled at the private, state, and local level with the leadership of HHS and USDA. DHS makes its resources available to instances involving food when requested by federal agencies or the President, or when multi-agency involvement requires the integration of federal, state, and local resources to preserve the security of our nation. DHS also makes its resources available to its federal partners and to its centers of excellence to do research in the area of threat. It makes its resources available to states to build surge capacity, to reduce the risk to the food supply, and to train and exercise food defense systems. Secretary Chertoff created the Office of Health Affairs as part of a reorganization on January 11, 2007. Its mission is to protect the health and security of the American people in the coordination and collaboration of the DHS components with federal, state, and local partners and the private sector. With specific reference to agri-terrorism, the Secretary appointed the Chief Medical Officer to be the official accountable for the implementation of the Department's responsibilities for veterinary food and ag security and it includes the coordination of the Department's responsibilities for the implementation of HSPD 9, the defense of U.S. agriculture and food. Number 2, in the area of post-harvest preparedness and homeland and HSPD 9. The enormity and complexity of the food sector poses substantial challenges to food defense and critical infrastructure. These challenges include overlapping roles and responsibilities among federal departments and agencies, and the Office of Management and Budget with the relevant food agencies are collaborating to address these issues. DHS brings unique and complementary tools and expertise to bear, and such tools as the National Security Risk Assessments and the integration of surveillance. The Department of Agriculture and FDA provides tools and expertise in the area of food and agricultural critical infrastructures. The Food and Drug Administration and USDA work closely with Customs and Borders on a day-to-day basis in imported food inspections and laboratory analysis. As a highlight, I would like to mention that these agencies work well together during the recent melamine incident, which is consistent with the intention of HSPD 9. HSPD 9 was issued to establish a national policy to defend the nation's food and agricultural systems against terrorist attacks, major disasters, and emergencies. DHS has 17 of the 21 tasks designated to us, and we lead or co-lead in 12 of these tasks. The landscape of food safety and defense is changing. Evolving risks include a tremendous growth of imported food markets. Federal and state regulatory programs, as well as laboratories, are currently the backbone of our nation's food safety network. Threats to the food supply typically cross state borders and have national implications. We need to be diligent in coordinating planning involving the key stakeholders, importantly including state and local authorities and the private sector. Realistic exercises help to develop the relationships, plans, and preemptive tools we need to prevent, mitigate, and respond to the food systems events. An alignment of resources at the interagency level with local, state, and national governments with strong collaboration with the private sector is or needs to be continually strengthened. Number 3, the way forward. We are focusing our efforts more completely on resilience within the food chain. DHS is currently studying key components of the nation's food chain in partnership with the FBI, USDA, and FDA in programs with the industries and the states to better understand the vulnerabilities of 50 major food and agricultural commodities. The challenge is sharing this information in an appropriate manner with all relevant stakeholders. FDA has a great example of a web-based tool as a first step. Another tremendous first step.
Dr. McGinn, if you could summarize your statement. We're way over the 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. In summary, a more resilient food infrastructure is the most important way to build resilient communities. The recent mayor of Gulfport said that a simple way of building resiliency is the restoration of a favorite restaurant. It gives a place for his people to rest in a tragedy, such as in recent hurricanes, and spend a few minutes outside of a familiar place with familiar food and finding confidence that the rest of his community will be restored. He clearly understood that the food system resilience is part of community resilience. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop with those comments, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGinn. Chair now recognizes Mr. Baldwin to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss the actions we are taking at Customs and Border Protection to ensure the safety of imported food. My name is Daniel Baldwin, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner in the Office of International Trade at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. My office holds the responsibility of formulating CBP's trade policy, developing programs, and enforcing U.S. import laws. The food and agriculture industry contributes significantly to the United States economy, and as the value and complexity of our food imports continues to grow, CBP recognizes the challenges we face to maintain a safe and secure food supply. CBP has taken great strides towards securing America's borders, including the protection of our food supply and the economic health of American agriculture. Since September 11, 2001, CBP's priority mission has been to secure the nation's borders from terrorists and terrorist weapons while facilitating the flow of legitimate travel and trade. In support of this mission, CBP has designed strategies to manage the risk of an agricultural product contamination that may cause harm to the American public or damage to the nation's economy. CBP has worked extensively to coordinate activities and enforcement actions with USDA and HHS. As the guardian of our nation's borders, CBP has broad authority to interdict imports of food and agriculture products at the ports of entry. We frequently interact with FSIS and FDA on questions regarding enforcement action, as those agencies house the subject matter expertise on food and agriculture admissibility. CBP is able to rely on statutory authority of other federal agencies with the specific mandate of enforcing food safety regulations to finalize enforcement actions on those food safety issues. As with our approach to anti-terrorism, CBP has taken a multi-layered approach to protect the safety of America's food imports. In my testimony today, I would like to highlight the three key aspects that CBP has utilized in its effort to date: CBP's national trade strategy, CBP targeting methodologies, and CBP personnel. After briefly discussing these three topics, I can highlight some of our experiences with these food safety operations. Pursuant to our twin goals of fostering legitimate trade and travel while securing America's borders, CBP has developed a national trade strategy to help our agency successfully fulfill our trade facilitation and trade enforcement mandate. Our national trade strategy is based upon 6 priority trade issues. These PTIs are anti-dumping countervailing duty protection, intellectual property rights enforcement, textile and wearing apparel enforcement, revenue protection, punitive actions, and of course, agriculture and food safety. Under the terms of our trade priority strategy, we focus CBP resources in our efforts to address these key areas of trade. I would like the committee to note that agriculture is one of our key 6 priority issues. The goals of our national agriculture strategy are: first, to detect and interdict any instances of agro and bioterrorism; second, to detect and prevent unintentional introduction of pests or diseases in the United States; third, to detect and prevent unintentional introduction, adulterated, contaminated, or unsafe agriculture and food products; and fourth, to promote our nation's economic security through the enforcement of these trade laws. To support this national strategy, CBP employs several robust targeting methodologies, ensuring the compliance and safety of our food and agriculture products imported in the United States. CBP, in coordination with FSIS and FDA, utilizes the following mechanisms to ensure safety of the American food supply. First, our automated targeting system, which is based on various algorithms and rules and is flexible, constantly evolving targeting system that integrates enforcement and commercial databases. ATS is essential to CBP's ability to target high-risk cargo entering the United States based upon advanced manifest information. Another system CBP uses is our automated manifest system, which provides us with the advanced cargo information to be used for targeting and screening of all imported merchandise. We utilize the AMS to ensure appropriate coordination with other regulating agencies. And finally, the automated commercial system, ACS, CBP's automated system of record for entry processing and cargo clearance, allows us to screen for additional food and agriculture risks. I'd also like the committee to note that the majority of the targeting criteria present in the system today are intended to prevent the introduction of contamination, pests, or disease. Approximately 87% of the criteria used in our ACS systems are agriculture related. In addition to these CBP systems, CBP also maintains the National Targeting Center. The NTC is the facility in which personnel from several separate government agencies are co-located to review advanced cargo information on all inbound shipments. Personnel from CBP, FDA, FSIS, APHIS are all stationed at the NTC. In addition to the sophisticated targeting systems in coordination between the agency, CBP maintains a diverse workforce that is specially trained to detect and prevent imports that may be harmful to the health of the American public. CBP officers and CBP agriculture specialists receive specific training on agrobioterror incidents, We currently have the ability to rapidly deploy more than 18,000 CBP officers, 2,000 agriculture specialists, and 1,000 import specialists in response to emerging threats to agriculture and food supply. Furthermore, CBP's Laboratory and Scientific Services maintains 8 separate laboratories around the country with a 24/7 technical reach-back center. While we have found various examples recently where we've coordinated closely with FDA and HHS and DHS along the lines of melamine, toothpaste, seafood imports, we're finding that that level of cooperation has been very important in ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply. Food defense and food safety concerns will only increase as world trade in food and agriculture continues to grow and diversify. CBP will continue to approach this as a challenge worthy of a combined government effort. We will continue to partner with other federal agencies in order to refine our targeting skills and ensure the prevention of contaminated products entering the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, other members of the committee for this opportunity to testify today, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I'll remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I now recognize myself for questions. I think the one thing that is on everyone's mind today is how secure are we in terms of preventing what happened in terms of contaminated food and products coming out of China from entering the food supply again. Are we there yet to ensure that it can't happen again? And so my question is, what efforts are underway to ensure that the Chinese don't continue to intentionally add melamine or other dangerous products to their exports? What is the U.S. doing to sanction China? And what does HHS expect to get out of its meeting with China at the end of the month? Pose that to the panel.
This is David Acheson at FDA. Maybe I could take a first shot at that since you specifically addressed HHS. Since the melamine issue, and in fact before that in relation to a number of technical issues, we've worked very closely with Chinese authorities to try to address specific food safety concerns. Clearly, the melamine situation was something that we did not predict. Since that's happened, there has been an ongoing and continues to be close dialogue with Chinese authorities to address this problem, to deal with it. I think we have to accept that their food safety system, the Chinese food safety system, is not the same as that in the United States. It is a rapidly expanding economy. They are exporting a lot of food to the United States, and we have to work with the government and build systems to essentially address that challenge. To that end, there are ongoing meetings with Chinese government officials. There will be one occurring at the end of this month. There'll be another one in August. There's a further one planned for September, all towards trying to develop a memorandum of understanding that will focus on how to address these problems.
Do you see them moving aggressively to mitigate these problems, to ensure that it's not going to happen again?
I think within the capacity of the Chinese government to attain those goals, yes. I think they're very committed to try to prevent it. But as I said, they are dealing with a very fragmented system. So one of the things they're trying to put in place, I think very deliberately, is a system of certification or authorization that will ensure that products that are exported do meet a certain level of safety and security to ensure that they won't harm American consumers.
And since we can't rely necessarily on the Chinese to fully solve this problem because the system is so fragmented, then what are we doing to step up our efforts? Are we there yet to ensure that the food coming in or product coming into the United States is secure?
Well, again, we are obviously focusing on the areas that are the greatest concern. Using a risk-based strategy, we focused on testing products that we had concerns about, either historically or because of human illness. That was what led to the recent announcement of the import alert in relation to aquacultured fish of 5 different species related to the use of specific drugs. And as you know, that there is now in place a hold so that we have to test that material. Clearly, the melamine in wheat gluten was something that we weren't anticipating. We learn from these things constantly as we move forward, trying to focus our strategies based on risk. Ultimately, where we need to take this, though, however, is to focus it on prevention. We need to prevent these problems from happening in the first place, as opposed to react to them when they do.
I agree. Dr. Maczka?
Well, I think FSIS does have a very robust import system where we are able to ensure the safety of food coming into the United States. It involves an initial determination of a country's equivalence to our systems. It also involves on-site audits and then reinspection of all products coming into the United States. If something were to go wrong with a particular product, we can increase audits in a country. We can step up reinspection of products coming into our country. We also, one of the things that we're working on collectively together here with Customs and Border Protection, DHS, and FDA, and the Centers of Excellence, is a study on melamine and other pathways that could be used for economic adulteration, and so that we could put protective measures in place.
Thank you. Dr. McGinn?
We are stronger and more secure than we've ever been in our food supply, yet incidences like melamine give us an opportunity to get even stronger. Since this incident, our Center of Excellence, who you'll hear from this afternoon, has been looking extensively at food imports from China and doing that in collaboration with USDA and FDA and Customs and Borders, as well as the intelligence community. So we're actually doing a review of the imported foods to see what additional concerns there are, and certainly be able to make those available to you.
Thank you. And Mr. Baldwin?
And very quickly, just to echo the comments made earlier, I think we do have the safest food supply security system in the world, and targeting and intelligence gathering, I think, is one of the key components, so that even when you do detect an incident like this, that we're able to have a concept of operations in place, how to deploy, how to proceed, so that we can mitigate any of these circumstances and anticipate any future developments.
I thank the panel. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. McCall, gentleman from Texas, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Just as a follow-up on the food imports from China, particularly the seafood, and maybe Dr. Acheson, you're the expert to address this. How confident are you that these imports coming into the country now from China, as I understand they have not been banned, what is your comfort level that there is no contamination, particularly given the fact that one of the certifying labs that qualifies to certify that it's not contaminated is actually in China?
FDA is very comfortable that those 5 fish that we have the import alert are essentially being held. You're correct in saying that it's not a ban. It's not intended to be a ban. What it's intended to be is a hold at the port of entry in some way, or in some holding situation, preventing it from going into commerce until FDA has seen clear evidence that the fish does not contain any of the antimicrobial agents that we have concern about. Now, you point out what can we do if we don't believe the lab results? Well, we can check the lab results. We can test it ourselves. We can ensure that the samples were taken correctly, that the assays were done correctly, that the controls were done correctly by reviewing the paperwork. And if we're not comfortable, it doesn't proceed.
Well, you said you can test it yourselves. I mean, do you?
We have certainly done that. We challenge things on a regular basis in terms of, I mean, import alerts are not new. We've been doing them for years, and we have many out there.
Let me just say, let's say it's certified in China that it's not contaminated, it comes in the country. Do you have any system of perhaps doing a sampling to ensure that this food is safe coming into the United States?
Yes, indeed we do. We undertake sampling assignments on top of import alerts. To give you a case in point, several years ago we had problems with cantaloupe from Mexico. There was a countrywide import alert, much like China. We worked with the government of Mexico to fix it. Once the country was coming off the import alert, we continued to test cantaloupe. It was fine for a couple of years. We then found a problem. We worked with the government again to fix it. So yes, simply because the import alert is not it. We will continue to follow up, and we'll continue to test, and we'll continue to look more widely.
How was this discovered in the first place? How did you discover that, gee, we have food coming in from China that's contaminated?
With the melamine, or with
the micro agents that were found in the fish?
Through testing programs. Those testing programs go back to 2001, where we first started to see problems. And we were putting individual companies on import alert when we've been doing that for some time. And we've been essentially ramping up, adding more and more companies to the point at which we said this isn't working, the technical discussions with China isn't solving the problems, we need to make this countrywide to protect the American consumer.
Okay. Mr. Baldwin, on another topic, we have a farm bill coming up this week in the Congress, and there's some discussion. In fact, some members of Congress would like to move inspection authority away from Customs and Border Patrol and give it back to the USDA at the inspections being done at ports of entry on the border. Now, can you comment, even though the USDA does not want that mission, by the way, not something I support, but can you comment on that, and then also comment on the transition that did take place between USDA to CBP at the border, and how well is that transition going, and how well are your inspections at the border?
Sure. First off, I would offer that I believe a transfer of our CBP agriculture specialists back to USDA would in fact be a detriment to our food supply security efforts. We have a significant number of diverse workforce that we have at the border that we can leverage and use for a diverse array of food supply chain issues. I think we have had tremendous success in the few short years since CBP agriculture specialists have been at the border with our CBP officers who look for immigration issues, cargo issues, and agriculture and pest contamination issues. I think we're underestimating the tremendous improvements we've made with USDA in forming our task force, in working with our Bioterrorism Act personnel with FDA and soon FSIS at our NTC. I think we are making tremendous headway in solidifying our efforts and creating the best food supply chain security efforts at the border. I think a move back, this reaction, would be a detriment to our efforts.
Thank you. I see my time has expired.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing and for making sure that it happened despite the fact that we had to put it off. And thank the panelists for, again, for your flexibility and being here this morning. I have a lot of concerns about our food safety, given all of what has already been referenced here by my colleagues and what seems to be a tremendous increase in food contamination and sometimes the length of time it takes to find out what the source is and so forth. So I'm hearing that coordination is improving and so forth. I hope so. I have a question a quick question for Dr. McGinn. The Office of Health Affairs, how does that relate to the Chief Medical Officer? Is that the same office? Is it, and is there some coordination there? And what is their role in the food safety issue?
The Chief Medical Officer is the head of the Office of Health Affairs.
Okay.
The Chief Medical Officer was about as a position is about a year old within DHS, and then most recently that has become the Office of Health Affairs.
Okay, I just want to make
and
sure.
And the veterinary component is a component of the medical component within DHS.
Okay. And Dr. Acheson, you talk about the laboratories that are in the FERN, in the network, and they include the 50 states and Puerto Rico. How does that network address issues of the territories, either the Virgin Islands or the ones in the Pacific?
The network is constantly expanding. And at this stage, I don't actually have specific information as to what's on tap in those, but I can certainly find that information and get that back to you specifically on that question. But that network's worked well. We used it in spinach and we used it in melamine.
Okay. And apparently a week ago or so, there was another hearing in one of the Energy and Commerce subcommittees, and what was reported there is a cause for a lot of concern. One that, and I read about this in the paper either Sunday or Monday as well, that FDA inspects about 1% of the food over which it has jurisdiction. This is what was reported at the subcommittee. And of that 1%, just a fraction is actually sampled, that the agency sometimes allows importers to take possession of suspect foods and arrange for their testing by private laboratories that may or may not be approved by FDA. This is from testimony given at a hearing in a House subcommittee last week. And the other issue is the fact that you have 13 laboratories that test for these kinds of problems, and 7 of them FDA intends to close. Can you just help me figure out, can you just respond to those concerns that were raised at another subcommittee here?
Sure. You've raised a lot of points there. Let me try and cover them briefly.
The 1%,
Yeah.
the private labs testing for suspect goods, private labs that are not FDA approved, and also the closing of 7 out of 13 laboratories that are used when, and it goes on, inspectors the number of inspectors are less, but the food imports have doubled,
Well, first of all, the 1% is correct. In order for a product to be imported, a food product to be imported into the United States, there are a number of things that has to happen. The paperwork for that, usually submitted electronically, is 100% screened through our prior notice center in collaboration with Customs and Border Protection. What that does is it will target certain foods that are of concern from a food defense, a bioterrorist perspective. And if we see anything anomalous there, it gets put to one side in terms of potentially a hold or an inspection. On the food safety side, again, all that food is screened electronically. Some of it where we have never seen a problem historically.
So 100% of it is screened, but 1% is inspected, is that what you're saying?
100% of it is screened electronically. About 80% of that electronic screening is then diverted for an FDA individual to look at it and make a determination, should this be inspected or should it not be inspected, based on experience. Now, a lot of that is stuff that goes through really quickly because, again, it's high volume, it's things we've never seen problems with. And that is how the 1% then gets picked out. It's based on risk, it's based on areas where we've seen problems, and it's based on concerns that we have either had in the past or currently have. So it is vetted 100%, but you're correct in saying that only 1% of it is actually physically inspected. In terms of the private labs, yes, private labs do get used as they are allowed to be used for import alerts. But again, FDA is able to look at the data from the private labs. They have to ensure that the samples are collected properly under the appropriate conditions, that the testing is done correctly, that the assays are validated, that the controls are appropriate. And if there's any problems with that, FDA will refuse to take that data and do. I could not tell you what percentage that we refuse, but I can find that out for you. But we do that. Finally, on the lab closures that you mentioned, yes, you're correct. There is a current consideration of consolidating labs. Those labs were developed and situated in the days when shipping samples around was much more complex than it is now. We can obviously, as we all know, ship materials across the U.S. very easily. The goal here is to improve efficiency, to improve throughput, and to do more, faster, cheaper. So that at the end of the day, even though physically some labs will close, we envisage that what we will be able to do here is to get more samples tested faster for less money, thus increasing overall efficiency, simply because of the way things move with modern technology.
Thank you for your answer. Mr. Chairman, I think that this bears some looking into, so that we can be sure that we're giving the proper oversight for some of these changes, the closing of the labs and the low percentage of inspections and some of the other issues raised.
I couldn't agree more, and I can promise you that we will continue to exercise aggressive oversight in this area. And this will certainly be the first of what I intend to be several hearings on the subject. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so very much for permitting me to come here today and to participate in this very important hearing. Thank you for your leadership on this issue, and it's a pleasure to join the panel, if only briefly. Thank you for your focus on food safety, an issue that I've followed for quite a number of years. I'd like to ask any of the panelists to respond to very specific questions here. Do any of you know what % of the U.S. food supply is currently imported, and what % of the U.S. drug supply is currently imported, or even generally speaking, what that might be?
Well, this is David Acheson, FDA. Let me start at least on the food supply, because I can speak to that. Drugs, I don't have that information, but we could certainly get that for you. Overall, it's about 13 to 15% of the U.S. food supply is imported, but it varies greatly with commodities. Seafood is about 80%. Others are much less. Produce varies with the time of year, but it can be 30 to 40%.
I would just like to add, I think it's somewhere between 4 to 5% of all imports in the United States are actually in our food supply.
4 to 5%?
Our food products. 4 to 5% of all imports of all products are food products.
What about drugs?
That information I don't have specifically, but I can be happy to get that for you.
Anyone want to take a guess? And I'm talking about the components of those products, not just the final product. Mr. Acheson, you don't want to comment on that?
I didn't come armed with information to specifically discuss importation of drugs, but as I've said, I'd be very happy to get that information to you.
Is it your sense that the majority come from offshore on the drug side?
I know that drug ingredients are imported, yes, but in terms of finished drugs, I think it's not a huge number.
I think the American people were very surprised to find that large amounts of our medications and perhaps vitamins are comprised of ingredients that come from offshore. I think it's quite a significant number. And it's surprising to me that you don't really have that at the top of your fingertips here today.
Well, I apologize. It is my remit is focused on foods and feed as opposed to drugs, but I promise we'll get that information to you.
Is it your impression that food imports and drug imports into the United States are growing? Any of the panelists who want to answer that?
On the meat, poultry, and egg side, no. And as far as your first question about
Meat and, excuse me?
meat and poultry, which is what FSIS regulates, 6 to 8% is imported. That's in response to your first question.
In response to your question about is it increasing, certainly on the food side, yes, it is.
Yes, and with 1% or less inspected as a country, we really haven't, we've been pretty lucky, actually. I wanted to ask you, who are the worst offenders by nation in terms of food safety and then drug safety? If you were to tick off those that have been cited the most times, which 3 countries would be at the top of your list, or which 5 countries would be at the top of your list as the worst offenders on the food side and then the worst offenders on the drug side?
In the context of the foods that FDA regulates, and we inspect and refuse foods on a regular basis. For example, in June, FDA refused foods from 80 different countries. China and India were at the top of the list, and certainly in recent months have been at the top of the list. Part of that is related to the volume of products that are imported. We do import a lot of foods from China and from India. So there's a denominator component to this. I suspect where you're going is the proportion or the percentage of foods from individual countries that are unsafe, and I don't have all the denominator information to hand, but again, you know, we could provide that.
To provide the inspection, do you focus on key importers?
In terms of the inspections, there are a lot of parameters that are weighed into this. From a food defense perspective, yes, intelligence, the country of origin, the foods, those kinds of things. On the food safety side, again, yes, in relation to prior track records, history of problems with the importers or the foods.
There's very little time remaining in my 5 minutes, but I did want to place on the record the distinction between what the U.S. Department of Agriculture calls a recall. If we find something that's out there that we're troubled with, there are all these stories that come out in the paper that we're going to recall certain products. The problem is that we recover almost none of it. Less than 5% or less is ever recovered. So we might read that something is recalled and people, oh, I feel so safe. The toothpaste is recalled, or the steak is recalled, or the hamburger is recalled, and or the fish is recalled. And yet the truth is that the Department of Agriculture, speaking for the Department of Agriculture, is able to recover almost none of it. So it's still out there. It's still out there. So I think it's very, I just wanted to place on the record in this very important subcommittee the fact that some of the language that's used is very misleading to the public. And I believe my time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Well, the general lady raises a very important point, and the American people need to be aware of this, and we need to see what we can do to step up efforts to address enhance the recall effort to make sure it actually has meaning, and that the product is actually recovered. I couldn't agree more. I thank the gentlelady, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Etheridge, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's vitally important. Let me ask the panelists, you know, this is a critical issue to the American people, and I want to go back so I can come forward. In November of 2003, GAO had a report titled Bioterrorism, a Threat to Agriculture and the Food Supply. And they found that most of USDA and the FDA's field staff had not received training on security matters, and although the field staffs were instructed to be vigilant and on heightened alert, they were also told not to document or report their observations regarding security at plants because the information could be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act request. My question is this: has this policy changed? Number two, can you confirm that staff are instructed not to document or report observations? And number three, do field staff currently receive security-specific training? Who wants to tackle it first? Okay.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, we perform food defense verification procedures in our plants every day, and I don't have the numbers with me, but it's hundreds of verification procedures are performed, and we document the results of those in what we call a memorandum of interview. The inspection personnel is supposed to take the results of that and discuss it with plant management so that countermeasures can be put in place. So I think our system there is quite strong.
Well, let me ask you a question. You didn't answer my question. Number one, has the policy changed? Was that correct? Did GAO put out in 2003, or was that incorrect?
The policy has not changed. We've been doing these food defense verification procedures since the events of 9/11, and we continue to do them. And our staff does get training, by the way. We have food defense awareness training of all of our field staff as well as headquarters staff.
So we do document,
Yes, we do document.
and we do report the observations.
Yes, we do, to our
whom?
trade associations and to industries so that countermeasures can be put in place. And we also analyze the information at headquarters to look for trends.
So it does come to the department?
Absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that? FDA?
Yeah, this is David Acheson. I'll speak to it on the FDA side. In terms of the training, we've been aggressively adopting a training program with our inspectors, mainly focused on raising awareness and having them understand the importance of giving out guidances to the industry in terms of what they can do to ensure the security of the food supply. As I mentioned in my oral, we have developed a program called ALERT, which is heavily focused on raising awareness. It basically operates from farm all the way through to retail. Virtually every inspector has been trained on ALERT. We developed a web-based training system for that, suitable for both industry and for our inspectors. And certainly about 2 months ago, we were up to about 96% of the inspectors had received that training and were implementing it. And we have used this in some of our assignments as well.
Okay, so it's currently in operation and it's ongoing.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. Dr. McGinn, can you describe what steps the department has taken to lead an interagency response to an act of agro-terrorism or other major disasters in the agricultural sector? Because obviously your department would have that charge, and specifically, what plans have you developed? What training exercises have you done? And what are the staffing changes in the department to accomplish the mission in your department?
Okay, as it relates to the staffing issues, our office is new, the Office of Health Affairs, and currently in this year we're actually adding people in the area of food as well as animal agriculture, public health, and agro threat. This year we're hoping to do, as the IG report said, to add the persons that are needed to actually staff up this coordinating role, up to about 11 people the first year, and then by the end of 2009. We're looking to add up to about 40 people to actually do this coordinating role, and several $1 million to do this effort. That's not a lot considering it's 1/6 of the economy, and this is a critical infrastructure for our country. In terms of the exercising and planning in terms of attacks on our country, one of the main ways that we, within the Department of Agriculture, are preparing for that is actually assisting the states to be prepared, because any incident that's going to be of a national significance is going to be in a lot of states at the same time. So one of our key responsibilities is to provide grants to the states to be able to then utilize to actually do the training and exercising and build the kinds of capacities that we need to have in order to be able to respond in multiple states.
Can you tell us where we are along that track in terms of getting it done?
In terms of the grant analysis, that's one of the key things. As I add personnel to our office, I intend to do. We've already begun the analysis of this, so we're looking at what the states are actually spending on those grants in terms of building this kind of preparedness. And the surge capacity within the labs as well as field personnel is critical, as you know. In order to effectively do this kind of analysis of the grants, I'm going to need some additional the personnel that we're bringing on staff right now to actually do that, and I'll be able to follow through on it's my intention to do an annual review of those grants and then to be able to share that information back with the states so that they'll be able to do a better job of competing for those resources to build capacity in the states.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
I thank the gentleman. Given the import of this issue and the fact that I know Chairman Thompson wanted to question, he is on his way back with the panel's indulgence. We're going to go to a second round of questions. So with that, I will begin recognizing myself. I wanted to inquire of Dr. McGinn. The Inspector General released a report in February on the role of DHS in post-harvest food security. The IG noted that there are 4 main limitations in DHS's efforts. First, DHS must improve internal coordination. Second, DHS needs to engage its public and private food sector partners more effectively. And third, DHS could do more to prioritize resources and activities based on risk. And finally, DHS must fully discharge its food sector responsibilities. So my question is, how many staffers has DHS dedicated to this mission, and how have you worked to improve these areas?
Within the 30 programs across DHS, there's several people that are actually involved. But in our office currently, I'm an office of 1, but I have the ability to actually add up to 5 people as FTEs and then some detailees as well to get to 11 by the end of this first year that we're in place. So the IG office, or the IG report recommended that we have a very limited number of staff and that we need to actually add to our resources to actually be able to protect, to discharge our responsibilities, not just for HSPD 9, but the other HSPDs, as well as other issues as was mentioned by the executive order and the Office of Budget and Management. There are lots of different issues that we're actually working to synchronize our resources in.
Do you feel that level of resources and staffing are going to be adequate to the mission?
It is very adequate to start the job in this first year of our existence. We're a new office, and we're rapidly developing the capabilities, not just in the veterinary area, but also in the medical areas as well. Coordinating those responsibilities across all of DHS is a huge task as well. So yes, we've got the resources to start the job, and then our ramp up over the next couple of years will in fact give us a full capability to discharge those responsibilities.
To the panel, Mr. Kennedy's testimony that we'll hear later suggests that food and ingredient movement is not well characterized across firms or food and ingredient products. He states that a clearinghouse for such information that would be accessible for research and threat purposes would be a significant step forward. What efforts are underway to create such a tool?
This is Dr. Acheson at FDA. I'm not sure I quite understand the scope of the question. Is it suggesting that the traceability is inadequate?
That's what I believe he's suggesting, yes.
Okay. Under the Bioterrorism Act, there is a requirement for certain facilities to maintain records of one up and one back, in other words, where they received the material from and where they sent it. That's served us well in relation to recent outbreaks. Obviously, we haven't had to test it in a terrorist situation. But that structure has allowed us to essentially trace forward and trace back when an outbreak occurs to determine origins and where food has gone.
Anyone else on the panel care to comment?
We also have procedures in place to trace forward and to trace back.
Thank you. I will, well, let me ask this last question within the time that I have left. You know, China has claimed that the U.S. was raising an unnecessary alarm about the safety of their food products. According to one of the ministries, one of the ministers, one company's problem doesn't make it a country's problem. If some food products are below standard, you can't say all the country's food is unsafe, end quote. Do you agree?
Let me take first shot at that. I would agree that one company's problem does not mean that there is a problem nationwide. However, if we return to the example of the imported fish, we have been putting one company at a time on import alert as we have been demonstrating that their products are problematic and of concern to the public health in the United States. Beginning last October, we expanded our surveillance of these categories of fish and did a lot of testing, and overall, about 25% of the species that we had concerns about from a variety of different companies contained these unapproved antimicrobial agents. So that was clearly not just one company, and it was at a point where we got to say this has to be countrywide. It's correct to say it's not 100%, but I do not believe for 1 minute we are overreacting. I think it's very important that we do this.
Anyone else on the panel?
Our process is such that we not only determine if a country's system is equivalent to us and is eligible to export to us, but we also look into whether establishments should be certified. So we take it on establishment by establishment basis as well as country basis.
Thank the panel. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. McGinn, I look forward to seeing your office go from a one-man shop to many hires in your office and ramping up your efforts. I know you're under a lot of, I wouldn't say stress, but a lot of responsibilities for one person to bear. So I look forward to seeing that progress. My second round of questioning has to do with something that impacts probably more my home state of Texas, and that is foot and mouth disease. When I go down to some of the border towns, you actually see cattle going back and forth between Mexico and Texas. That's been going on for a long time, and obviously the threat of contamination is real. In Minnesota, we had a recent scare of foot and mouth disease, which actually turned out not to be foot and mouth disease, but it did provide, I think, an opportunity for USDA and DHS to sort of test their efforts working together on this. And just my questions to the panel, could you comment on the coordination between USDA and DHS on that issue in this particular case, and then if you could comment also on the overall threat, if you will, of foot and mouth disease, which would have a real damaging impact not only on border states but on the whole ranching industry.
Yeah, I'll lead off. As it relates to that recent incident that you were describing, it was an excellent opportunity, as most incidences are, for us to develop additional strength and capability. Some of the encouraging things that we did in a collaborative sort of way was we immediately were on the cell phone with each other. We have each other's cell phones. We call each other anytime, day of night, and that was certainly when the incident was brought to our attention. It was in the evening, and the questions or the requests that came to us were of an intel nature. And so what we were asked to do was to look at the potential intentional aspects of this, to rule out or rule in these sorts of things early on, because the sooner you can determine if there's an intentional component, particularly in a biological or chemical situation, you're much farther ahead of the ability to contain that situation. So we were asked, and we worked through the night actually on behalf of USDA to actually determine that the issues of risk around intentional introduction. Another thing that was really very encouraging that was done was Customs and Borders Protection and USDA worked together to look at if in fact we were to have an incident that would progress, that we would need to be able to know in the last few weeks what animals had actually come across the border, so that we know the size of the tracing out that needed to be done. And it was incredibly encouraging how quick that information was able to be brought together from their joint efforts, and they got not just all the cattle and swine, but they got down to the camels and the goats and everything else that had come into the country over that period in time. So those two are two great examples of some increased collaborative work that was done. One more that I'd add to that is the Center of Excellence, and you'll hear from Shaun Kennedy this afternoon, had worked closely with the plant owners in Minnesota to actually deal with that situation, so that there's the feedback loop from the private sector that these centers of excellence are so helpful in at creating for all of us. That was a part of that incident as well. So 3 examples of increased and excellent coordination.
That's good to hear. Mr. Baldwin, do you have any comments?
I would just echo what Dr. McGinn has said. I think that we've found that our cooperation with USDA, especially on the foot and mouth issue, has just been tremendous. I mentioned earlier in my testimony, I think that 87% of our criteria in our automated commercial systems are dedicated to agriculture and food system, and I would tell you that those are predominantly on the foot and mouth issue that we've been addressing for quite a few years. So I think that the work we've done over the past few years on foot and mouth with USDA has been a tremendous example of how cross-cutting work with the agencies is really the way to go, and how it has proven to be successful, and we're always working to improve that.
Dr. Maczka, you mentioned in your opening statement avian flu and poultry. Obviously, that's of great concern, as the risk would be very high. How much of our, we talked a lot about the fish coming from China being contaminated, but how much of our poultry is actually imported from Asian countries?
Right now, we receive, none of our products no products are coming in from China. No meat, poultry, or egg products, FSI-inspected products are imported from China, and no establishments, processing establishments, are certified to export to us. The numbers that I gave before, 6 to 8% of our poultry and meat is exported, and I don't have the breakdown of what is meat and what is poultry, but I can get that to you.
But in terms of what Americans consume,
most of it is
that is homegrown in the United States.
That's correct.
And raised and not imported. Okay.
Right.
I see my time has expired.
I thank the gentleman. The chair is now pleased to recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. One of the issues I think the committee is grappling with is who would be in charge if something happened. And I guess I'll go with Dr. McGinn first by saying if an incident of national significance was declared along the lines we've talked about, who would be in charge?
Well, if an incident of national significance is declared, then the Department of Homeland Security is the coordinator of the overall response. Therefore, we would be in a leadership role as it relates to that. The technical leads come from whatever emergency support function that's involved with the incident. In this particular situation, if it was both FDA and USDA as technical leads, then we would be coordinating with them in terms of the subject matter expertise and the legal responsibilities within our responsibilities for an incident of national significance to coordinate under the National Response Plan.
So is your definition of coordination the equivalent of being in charge or just serving as the traffic cop for the particular incident?
Well, being in charge is exactly what it means, but it also recognizes that the subject matter expertise, whether we're talking transportation or we're talking food or health as sectors, recognizing that those expertise are needed, and that emergency support function actually leads to support in that particular area. We definitely hope when an incident, whether it's food or agriculture related, would be first, and most of them are, incidents at the local level. And then if they, like most, the progression of most incidents is if it progresses to the place where it's at the state level, and then the state would be in charge. If it progresses further, then either FDA or USDA are actually in charge. So as the incident progresses, and they can progress very fast or they can progress slow, who's in charge changes as it does within any incident command system type responsibility, as you know from your work in firefighting.
Dr. Acheson, you've heard Dr. McGinn's comments about the coordinating role of DHS. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And there's no conflict between who's in charge, who's the lead in this scenario?
No, I mean, as Dr. McGinn pointed out, things tend to build up at some speed or another. For example, spinach. FDA was in charge of that. It wasn't declared a national emergency. We stayed in charge and we took care of it. We worked with other federal agencies during the course of that. Melamine was slightly different. Again, it was very close coordination efforts between FDA, USDA, DHS, and a whole variety of other federal agencies in that context. So absolutely, depending on the level of the emergency, it will vary who's in charge, but we're totally in sync with that.
Dr. Maczka, would you like to respond to that?
I'm in agreement with my colleagues here that that's pretty much the way it works. And actually, we've tested it out in some of our state district exercises where we've invited our colleagues to these exercises, and it's played out that way.
And so you all have basically said that there's no gray area as we proceed along this line in terms of who's in charge, whether the protocols are already established, and all of that.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. And I think as we go forward, you will see some, Mr. Chairman, some other comments relating to this, but I wanted to make sure we were on the record with that issue. I yield back.
I thank the chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. At this time, the first panel of witnesses is dismissed, and the chair now calls up our next panel. Thank you. I'd like to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Thank you for being here today. Our first witness is Shaun Kennedy, the Deputy Director of the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota is a DHS Center of Excellence, and we are certainly happy to have you here today, Mr. Kennedy. Our second witness is Dr. Lee Myers, and State Veterinarian and Assistant Commissioner of the Animal Industry Division in the Georgia Department of Agriculture. Dr. Myers has spearheaded numerous initiatives to improve the state's and the nation's capacity to prevent and respond to agricultural emergencies, including acts of agro-terrorism. And welcome you here today as well. Our third witness is Dr. Craig Henry, Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs, Grocery Manufacturers Food Products Association. Dr. Henry, we thank you for being here, and please send our regards to Dr. Matthys, who is going to testify before we switch the schedule on him, so we appreciate you filling in. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record, and I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss recent events involving the food system in the United States and our future needs for reducing the possibility of intentional disruption or contamination of this system. As you've noted, I'm here today as a representative of the university community that is committed to finding new solutions to protecting the food system, and also as the co-director of the National Center for Food Protection and Defense. At the center, we are focused on fundamental and applied research to develop new strategies, tools, and approaches to address the threat of intentional food contamination. The university research community is one important partner with the public and private sectors in developing innovative solutions to the threat presented by intentional food contamination. Food terrorism is not a new threat. In fact, the use of food as a weapon is actually one of the oldest weapons that is still of concern for catastrophic harm. Our ever more global food system now means that intentional contamination at one location can literally reach around the country or across the globe to cause economic harm, illness, and even death in multiple locations simultaneously. I have been personally struck by the degree to which the public intuitively understands the threat of intentional contamination of the food system. One group of NCFPD researchers found that consumers would allocate more funding to protect the food system than a range of other critical infrastructures, even though they perceive the relative probability of an attack on the food system to be lower than those other infrastructures. Upon reflection, this is not surprising. The food system is the one critical infrastructure where we cannot take ourselves out of the target population. The implications of this are not trivial. I think it is important to consider that a long history of federal, state, and local food safety regulations and enforcement has allowed us to be confident not only in the safety of our food, but in the quality of our government. A loss of public confidence in our ability to deliver a safe food supply could challenge both public trust in government and public confidence in the integrity of our food system. There is unfortunately, however, no silver bullet for fortifying the food system. The strengths of our system, affordable and fresh fruits, vegetables, meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy all year long, also represent the challenges of this complex system. The federal and state agencies and the private sector which owns and manages the food system have all made dramatic strides in protecting the food system from potential terrorism since it became a front and center concern. There is, however, much more to be done, and we should not be surprised by this. Protecting our food supply from intentional contamination represents a far more difficult challenge than the Mother Nature problems we're used to dealing with, since it involves things that shouldn't happen. While zero risk is by definition unachievable, through intensive and targeted research, we can reduce the risk. Research themes that I believe to be central to this effort that NCFPD is actively engaged in include the following. The first is event modeling, and that's how we can stay ahead of terrorists and others who want to cause us harm. One of the criticisms from the 9/11 Commission was that the various federal agencies suffered from a lack of imagination. In short, terrorists had explored more innovative threat scenarios than those for which the government had prepared. Having learned this lesson once, we cannot afford to do so again. Realistic, flexible, and dynamic models of potential food system events are thus an invaluable tool for vulnerability and consequence assessment, intervention prioritization, and resource allocation and decision support during an event. The second area of focus is in agent and food matrix interactions. We know a great deal about how conventional foodborne pathogens interact with food and the environment, and yet it is still not entirely clear how the E. coli 015787 contaminated the spinach in last year's outbreak. Intentional contamination of food for public health or economic harm or economic opportunism elevates the challenge of understanding how agents interact with the food system to an entirely new level. Efforts are unfortunately complicated by the fact that traditional select agents comprise only a small subset of the agents of concern. With the food itself serving as a very effective and efficient delivery vehicle, the agents of concern go well beyond those of traditional chemical and biological weapons considerations. All of you are undoubtedly familiar with the sniffer at Ronald Reagan National Airport, which represents a great stride forward in detecting potential explosives to prevent them being taken onto airplanes. Detecting potential explosives in air samples, however, is very different than rapidly detecting agents of concern in frozen cream of broccoli soup or hot dogs, let alone a truck of produce. Novel sample acquisition and pre-analytical processing strategies are therefore a crucial link in any effective detection strategy. Third, the food system is very much that, a system. As such, it presents inherent challenges with respect to risk and vulnerability assessment, as well as prioritization of investments to enhance food system protection. Unlike many of the 17 critical infrastructures and key resources, it is primarily composed of complex systems and its specific elements within these systems and the interdependencies of these systems that are of most concern. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to talk with you about recent food system events and the challenges they represent for protecting and defending our food supply. We need better food system intelligence, more flexible and responsive prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery strategies, and an expanded armamentarium of technologies and trained professionals to meet these new challenges. The university research community is an important partner in this national imperative. As co-director of the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, I'm honored to have had this opportunity to provide you with my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The chair now recognizes Dr. Myers for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify as to the state involvement in protecting our nation's food and agricultural systems. My name is Lee Myers. I'm the State Veterinarian and Assistant Commissioner with the Georgia Department of Agriculture, and I'm appearing here today on behalf of the National Association of the State Departments of Agriculture and as President of the United States Animal Health Association. NASDA represents the commissioners, secretaries, and directors of agriculture in the 50 states and 4 territories, and the USAHA has served as the nation's animal health forum for well over a century. I'd like to outline the critical role that state agriculture departments play in defending agriculture and food in our country and describe our efforts and challenges to build capacity to combat food and agricultural emergencies. State agriculture departments license, permit, inspect, and oversee activities along the entire farm-to-fork continuum in cooperation with our federal partners with USDA and FDA. You may be surprised to hear that 80% of all food inspections nationwide are conducted by representatives of state and local authorities. State employees by the thousands are on the ground each day inspecting agricultural facilities at the operational level. We're on farms and on buying stations, slaughterhouses, food processors, cold and dry storage units, warehousers, wholesalers, retail, and food service establishments. We also oversee the transportation of agricultural commodities and products between all of these entities. Our employees collect samples, analyze those samples in state laboratories, and issue seals of approval that commodity or products meet the government standards to be transported, planted, processed, or otherwise consumed by the general public. When problems arise, such as these recent recalls that have been discussed earlier today of spinach, peanut butter, canned meat products, and pet foods, it's employees at the state departments of agriculture that respond within hours to track down these contaminated products, assure that these recalled items are removed from the grocery shelves, and directly oversee their destruction. Also, state departments of agriculture are the primary agencies responsible for the protection, response, and recovery to animal and plant pests and diseases, natural disasters, and other hazards that can harm the agricultural industry. We must recognize that 99% of emergencies are not incidents of national significance and are managed by state and local authorities, not the federal government. This includes an outbreak of a foreign animal disease, which will be managed through a unified command structure with our colleagues in USDA, utilizing state-issued quarantines and state requirements for carcass disposal and state requirements for debris removal. DHS recognizes that state regulatory programs and laboratories are the backbone of the nation's public network for ag and food safety. What I have described, gentlemen, is the boots-on-the-ground frontline defense for our nation's food and ag. This is a day in the life of the State Department of Agriculture. Although the vast majority of resources in these tactical operations and interfaces with the private sector are realized at the community level, states are the most underfunded component of the National Food and Ag Security Strategy. Available funding is irregular, it is modest, and on a catch-can basis. So how can Congress help us get it right and overcome the challenges of building the necessary capability to combat food and ag emergencies? Firstly, there's an urgent need for Congress to provide consistent and sustained funding to state agricultural authorities to develop agricultural security programs and abilities within each state. The USAHA at its last annual meeting passed a resolution urging Congress to appropriate funding to states for the development of animal emergency management plans and implementation of sustainable capabilities. It's difficult to rationalize that the U.S. government doles out billions to protect our ability to surf the World Wide Web, and yet the March 2007 Congressional Research Service reports indicates that agriculture has received on average 2% of the non-defense Homeland Security budget over the last 5 years to assure that we have a safe and secure food supply, one of the primal essentials to sustain life. Ag and food defense must become a national priority and require that it be named as a state priority on state strategic plans. We believe that resources should be directed to each state agency and that Congress and federal departments should develop a detailed, integrated budget with sustainable dollars. Secondly, we recommend that Congress request federal departments to work with states to expedite the development and implementation of tools to identify critical infrastructure and key resources and conduct vulnerability assessments. NASDA, in cooperation with USDA, FDA, and DHS, announced the availability of a model food emergency response template over a year ago. And this template provides a guidance for managing food emergencies of varying magnitudes. However, state government agencies need assistance to develop and implement their food emergency plans, and we believe it's cost-effective to invest in state and local governments with these valuable tools. NASDA has also partnered with other stakeholders to develop similar tools for the animal and plant sectors, but again, resources are short to complete the development and implementation for tactical work in the states. Thirdly, there's no operational, comprehensive, and secure communication network for agriculture to share these alerts of threats and in linking local, state, federal, and private partners with appropriate security clearances. DHS has identified strengthening information sharing and collaboration as a specific priority, but quite frankly, progress is moving at a snail's pace. And as a consequence, we have these duplicative communication systems that rarely communicate with each other. A single integrated Homeland Security communication network for all sectors, including ag and food, should be imperative and a time certain established. Fulfillment of these three requests would be a good start in mitigating the current crisis of confidence that was referenced earlier. In conclusion, the State Departments of Agriculture and USAHA appreciate the efforts of Congress and the administration to enhance the safety and security of our food supply, but yet there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we want to be full partnerships with our federal colleagues to help ready America to prepare for, to plan for, and to stay informed during significant agricultural or food emergencies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to share a state perspective with the committee.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. The chair now recognizes Dr. Henry to summarize your statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for inviting GMA to participate in this hearing to discuss federal efforts to mitigate vulnerabilities to the food supply chain. The food industry is committed to assuring safety and security of the U.S. food supply. Food defense addresses the intentional adulteration of food products and/or ingredients using chemical, biological, radiological agents. This requires vigilant effort from the food manufacturer to know how to identify the vulnerabilities and to adopt effective mitigation strategies. The food industry has worked collaboratively with various federal agencies for several years now to ensure the best practices are identified and disseminated, and to develop mechanisms for federal agencies to share intelligence with the food industry that can enable companies to target their vigilance. In preparing for a deliberate attempt to contaminate the food supply, food companies have participated in vulnerability assessments with government officials, with industry trade associations, or independently, and participated as well in tabletop exercises designed to simulate an actual attack on the food supply. Food safety and food defense are the ultimate goal of all food companies, and achieving that goal requires the cooperative efforts of the regulatory agencies, that's federal, state, and local, as well as the food industry. Deliberate contamination of the food supply is still viewed as a relatively low potential risk but of serious concern versus food safety concerns from conventional contamination or product mishandling or mislabeling, which also includes economic adulteration, which has the potential to be a food safety event. I would like to mention the Strategic Partnership Program on Agri-Terrorism. The SPA, as it is referred to, is a cooperative initiative among federal and state government agencies and private sector volunteers to provide government and industry with more complete sector-wide perspective of food and agricultural defense. Under the initiative, vulnerability assessments are conducted in the food and agriculture sector using Carver plus shock evaluation to help distinguish between real and perceived food defense vulnerabilities and risks. The Public Health, Security, and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002, otherwise known as the Bioterrorism Act, provided FDA with the authority to promulgate regulations concerning registration of food facilities, establishment and maintenance of records, prior notice of imported food shipments, and administrative detention of food. FDA rules are in place and are being enforced. Unfortunately, funding for the 600-plus additional inspectors initially provided to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition to better enforce the regulations has evaporated, and the agency has had to reduce staffing to cover the budget. This has largely negated any gain in efficiency the agency perceived by having prior notice of all food imports so they could coordinate sampling and inspection efforts. Agency funding is critical to enforcement operations. GMA is an active member of the Food and Agriculture Sector Government Coordinating Council. This is a self-organized, self-run, and self-governed committee composed of members in the food and agricultural sector, and serves as the government's point of entry into each sector for developing and coordinating a wide range of infrastructure protection activities and issues. There is also the Food and Agricultural Sector Joint Committee on Research. This committee has identified a number of private sector needs, such as better vulnerability assessment tools. As mentioned previously today, FDA recently released a Carver plus Shock software tool that provides a means for all companies to conduct a vulnerability assessment of their operations. Carver Shock Vulnerability Assessment Tool is used to assess the vulnerabilities within a system or infrastructure to an attack. As you may know, Carver being an acronym for criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. The seventh attribute, shock, has been added to the original 6 to assess and combine health, economic, psychological impacts of an attack within the food industry. Lastly, I'd like to mention another valuable tool, which is the tabletop exercise. Joint industry regulatory agency, health department, and law enforcement officials participate in training exercises simulating an intentional product contamination event. Thank you for the opportunity of being here with you today, and I'm pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, and I'm glad you brought up the Carver Plus Shock program. I was reading in my briefing material about this program, and it's an important tool, obviously. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. To the panel, based on your work with the federal government over the years, how would you grade the federal effort on food security? Start with you, Mr. Henry, Mr. Kennedy.
I've been greatly encouraged by the collaboration we've received since we started with the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, and how all three of the primary agencies are very much working with us on advancing the research to try and further protect the food system. We work very closely with FSIS, with CIFSAN, and with the Office of Health Affairs and DHS. And they, as I believe Carol Maczka mentioned in the first panel, we are now working together on an imported foods research project specifically related to China and the other foreign countries.
Thank you, Dr.
From the industry perspective, I would say the process that's been put forth by the federal government has certainly matured and improved since the onset of 9/11. Initially, and I think during the early years, the industry saw a real challenge amongst the various agencies to have, if you will, nice coordinated communications so that each agency knew what was going on, how the funding was being applied, what the net results were going to be. And I think that has really portrayed itself very well in recent years. Currently, through the SPA initiative and other integrated stakeholder programs, we are much better set now to execute a program should it occur with an event that develops within the United States.
Dr. Myers?
I believe there's been tremendous efforts put forward by the federal government. However, there still remains a large disconnect between the Beltway here in the Washington area and federal departments and what's happening in the real world, boots on the ground level with state governments. State governments need to be brought in as full working partners, many times at the developmental stage rather than at the end of the process, where we are asked for casual comments very often on short timelines. We want to be full working partners throughout the continuum of developing from the initial policy development stage to full implementation. So there has been tremendous effort, I think, particularly working collaboration between federal governments, but there needs to be great enhancement of a reaching out and working with local and state partners.
So to quantify this a little more, I want to ask each of you to assign a letter grade to the federal government's efforts on food security. Mr. Kennedy.
I'd say a B at this point.
Dr. Henry?
Concur, a B would be appropriate.
I concur, a B.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, the University of Minnesota has a great food security simulation that has been funded by DHS. How is this simulation been put to work, and can you tell us about some problems that your scientists are most concerned about today?
The simulation that I believe you're referring to is something called the Consequence Management System, and it's built by obtaining data from the private sector and how food actually moves within the system, both internationally and in the United States, combined with public health system response data on how we would expect an actual outbreak to progress. So it allows us to provide more realistic evaluations of how potential intentional food contaminations would unfold, what would the consequences be, and therefore how would certain interventions change that outcome to reduce the possible consequences. One of the challenges in developing a system like this is that it's very dependent upon the private sector data, and quite understandably, the private sector needs to protect that information, so we don't have an easy vehicle to ensure that we have all the appropriate data into the models on private sector food movement. Second challenge that we encounter is we don't have a good idea of exactly how the public health system will respond if there is an event. As a simple example, in a research study 2 years ago, the researcher found that emergency room physicians, when presented with a case history, got Bacillus anthracis right 75% of the time on the first try, and botulism neurotoxin right 50% on the first try. How fast will we know when it actually happens? That's an unknown in our models.
Thank you. Briefly, Dr. Henry, you spoke about the Comr plus shock program. I know one of your biggest issues is for the private sector is a better vulnerability assessment tool. So can you expand upon how the Comr plus shock software tool is helping you, and what more is the private sector looking for in this area?
Certainly. The Comr plus shock tool now being brought to bear online by FDA is a very positive step forward. As you know, a number of our members are large as well as small and very small production facilities They do not have the luxury of coming to various places, especially like Washington, D.C., to obtain training in the area of carver shock. This online tool will provide an excellent vehicle for them to capture that information and match it against their own in-house food defense program. We see the carver shock program, of course, being enhanced through additional efforts, such as the one that we will be carrying forth with GMA later on this year, where we will be doing an online webinar for basically open to certainly our members and others, where they can gain hands-on input, ask questions, and try to expedite the utilization of that tool.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Henry.
Welcome.
Thank the panel. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Call, gentleman from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. When we look at this threat, I see two scenarios. One is man-made. One could be intentional, deliberate, and active terrorism. The other, probably more likely scenario, is accidental. Could be natural. Certainly could be man-made, but not an intentional act. And I agree with you, Dr. Henry, that the threat level of a deliberate attack is low, and let's hope it stays that way. But the risk could be very high. Dr. McGinn and I discussed, one nightmare scenario of botulism being put in an ice cream factory, which is distributed all throughout the country, and of course, children would be the primary consumers. And I know there are all sorts of nightmare scenarios. My first question is, we just heard from the panel of federal experts, FDA, DHS, USDA, about their efforts. One of the biggest, more recent concerns is the importation of contaminated fish from China. That could be just as damaging as a deliberate attack. So whether a country is, we're importing, from a country that actually intentionally wants to harm us through that vehicle, or just accidental. How confident are you, and this is to the panel as a whole, that our ability to screen and sample as our imports come into this country, how confident are you in terms of our ability to secure and make safe the food coming into this country?
I may take an initial stab at that. That's one of the things we're struggling with at the state level is the increase in ethnic and diversity of foods, many times that have foreign labels that are difficult for us to translate with symbols we don't understand. And these type of foods are increasing at an alarming rate through imports. So I think we're very concerned about the type of foods, the volume, and the different mechanisms by which they land on the shelves. Our ability can only be as good as we are informed and trained. And so again, I point to the disconnect that we really need better information sharing. We need better training tools. A lot of these are actually tested in state laboratories. And I may use the melamine as a recent example. You may remember is actually the veterinary community that discovered the problem initially in companion animals. And so there's a disconnect, again, between companion animal surveillance, what we might see there. The majority of these diseases through animals are zoonotic. They're contagious from animals. So we have a lot of shoring up to do. There's a lot of lessons learned and gaps that we need to overcome. And a lot of this was discovered in state veterinary labs first. So as was pointed out, I think our main gap is the ability to quickly detect that something is there before we diagnose it or recognize it as an outbreak.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. Dr. Henry?
Yes, I think the foremost issue here on dealing with imports or any other products coming into the United States, but particularly focusing today on food, is funding. As you may be aware, GMA is a member of the Coalition for a Stronger FDA. Many efforts have been put forth here on the Hill to try to have Congress focus on the lack of funding that's necessary, as was brought up in my testimony. Funding tied with proper resource allocation is paramount to getting the job done. I think that, as Dr. Acheson testified early, that when you have known agents, it makes it a lot easier to go out there and try to make sure your screening and your inspection process is adequate and efficacious. Certainly the situation with melamine, the food industry, along with the federal government and the state agencies, we're all kind of scratching our head, and we're working very diligently right now to try to identify what the unknown agents are. And in this case, of course, it was pretty well defined as not an intent of harm, but more of an intent of economic adulteration to create a low-grade product into a high-grade product and then command a higher price. I think as we go through this process, we also need to look at the funding which Dr. Myers brought to bear. In the case of Carver Shock or the SPA meetings or anything else, the state agencies certainly are not getting the funding they need and many times do not have the resources to attend a lot of these events. And I think that that is paramount, especially if we're going to maintain a close communication and operating system to address these things. I certainly want to touch upon two other areas, and that is the importance of risk-based inspection and allocating risks among both the USDA and the food safety inspection system directly and FDA. As you may know, GMA leads the coalition for risk-based inspection and certainly would look forward to Congress moving that along because that is an excellent platform for the United States to embrace today. We also are driving now forth with our industry on a food safety task force, and later this fall we will be holding a special symposium here on suppliers' best practices, and that workshop is really to get down and try to define what we're doing right and what we can do better to make sure the imports coming in the United States are safe and meet the quality that the consumer expects today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, do you have any comments?
In addition to concurring with the other panelists, I'd like to just point out one item of additional concern, which is that as you look at the box of food that you eat tonight, or the can that you pick up, look at that list of ingredients and recognize how many of those ingredients we don't know necessarily what country they came from when they are in that finished product. So as Mr. Langevin pointed out earlier in my written testimony, there's a comment on a repository for information on where food comes from, how it moves that we could trace. Right now, if there were intelligence indicating that a specific country source of an ingredient were of concern, a food company may not actually know that their ingredient comes from that particular company or country. We don't have that supply chain verification mandated all the way back to the primary supplier.
I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to working with you on legislation to address this important issue.
Likewise, I thank the ranking member. I want to thank the witnesses for the valuable testimony and again, the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and I would ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Your presence here was important, and I thank you for that. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee now stands adjourned. We got it all in before the votes were called. So.
What's that?
And we got it all in.
Oh, I know. We're taking a break. Yeah. May even have time to get something to eat.